Story 1, The Lantern by the Old Trail. I was finishing a late patrol near Raven's Hollow, the sky already deepening into that kind of darkness that swallows the mountains whole, when I noticed it. A faint orange glow swinging gently along the old switchback trail. That trail had been closed for decades after the landslides took most of the hillside with it, and anyone familiar with the area would have sworn no one could walk there without falling straight into the brush, or worse. My first thought was a lost hiker. I radioed in, voice tight, telling dispatch I'd investigate a possible straggler, then started down the path, flashlight cutting arcs through the dense undergrowth. As I moved closer, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The light didn't behave like a person's lantern. It floated, drifting along the trail with a steady rhythm, never slowing on steep patches, never hesitating over roots or fallen logs. Every instinct I had screamed that something about it wasn't right. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" But the trail swallowed my voice, and the glow simply swayed ahead, unbothered. I pressed on, boots crunching on loose stones, leaves damp with evening dew. The trees were close here, older than I'd ever seen, their branches hanging low, like the forest was leaning down to listen. Each step felt heavier than the last, the kind of heaviness that creeps into your chest when the air itself seems wrong. The glow never came closer. It was always just a few yards ahead, mocking my progress with its stubborn steadiness. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, a camper with a lantern walking in the dark, but there had been no recent maps showing anyone allowed there, and I knew every turn of the trail as if I'd walked it in my sleep. By the time I reached the place where the trail collapsed into a jagged drop, I realized I'd been holding my breath without knowing it. The lantern hung just beyond the edge, swaying above a section of broken earth that fell into shadow and rot. My mind screamed at me to step back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I reached the last solid patch of trail, heart hammering so loud I was sure the sound would alert anything watching. And then the lantern went out, just like that. One heartbeat it swung, the next it was gone, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own blood coursing through my ears. I turned to retreat, but the trail behind me had changed. What had been a clear path minutes ago was now thick brush, as if the forest itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. Panic gnawed at my ribs. I tried to backtrack, trying to remember each twist and step, but nothing matched. Every bend I thought I recognized led to another dead end, or a wall of brush so thick I had to hack at it with my flashlight, thinking I might have to climb the hillside blindly. Hours slipped past in a haze of thorns and mud, my flashlight beam flickering. The forest pressing in closer with every step. Every sound was amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind through the hollows, until I began to question whether anything else was out there at all, or if it was all inside my head. Eventually, I stumbled down to a familiar clearing near the creek, the moon low and cold, and I paused to catch my breath. The forest had released me, but it didn't feel like release. My body ached, my clothes were torn, and the blood of scratches dark on my sleeves. I tried to mark the trail in my mind, the exact switchbacks where the collapse had happened, the place I had seen that ghostly glow, but nothing aligned with the maps or any recollection I could trust. It was as if the trail had never existed. For weeks I checked the maps, even the old ranger surveys, and no one else had ever reported that path. Not in decades, not since the slides. And I couldn't shake the memory of the light. Not just the glow, but its movement, the unnatural steadiness, the way it hovered over the broken earth, waiting for me. I tell myself it was a hiker, maybe a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or the cold mountain air. But I've worked these trails for years, walked miles alone at night, and never seen anything like it before, or since. Every time I drive past Raven's Hollow, I imagine that glow waiting for someone else to follow, swinging slowly along the trail no one else remembers. Even now, the thought settles into my chest like a weight I can't lift, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still see it, faint and orange, swaying just beyond the edge of the forest, watching. Story 2, Whispers at the Fire Tower. My shift had ended well past midnight, and the forest was quiet in that way that feels alive, not in the sense of birds or animals, but in the slow, deliberate breathing of the mountains themselves. I was walking down from the old fire tower, the one at the ridge I'd climbed countless times, its rusted metal steps familiar beneath my boots. When I first heard it, voices. Soft, low, and deliberate, almost conversational, like two people leaning close to share secrets. My first thought was some kind of prank, kids wandering late, or maybe hunters. But the tones, some syllables too deliberate, too precise, were in a language I didn't recognize. I froze mid-step, listening. The voices didn't carry through the treetops the way normal human voices do. They seemed to hover just above the platform, wrapping around the metal framework, refusing to disperse. My pulse hit my throat. I climbed back up, trying to keep my movements deliberate, slow, careful. The wind rattled the tower, and I had to convince myself to keep going, foot over foot, despite the tightening knot in my chest. The hatch to the observation deck was supposed to be locked, welded shut after the tower was decommissioned years ago, but the voices were clear, closer now. I reached the hatch and called out, voice cracking. Nothing. Just those murmurs, soft but insistent, circling each other like a dance I couldn't follow. My hand trembled on the latch. And when I forced it open, they stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the voices, heavy, pressing, like the forest itself had paused. The platform was empty, bathed in the cold light of the moon, shadows I'd seen 1,000 times stretching exactly the same as always. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, except me, heart hammering. I leaned over the guardrail, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that maybe the wind had carried whispers from another part of the forest. Then I heard them again, clear, deliberate, circling below, coming from the base of the tower. I froze. The voices weren't following me, not exactly. They were moving independently, as if they had a purpose, circling the tower like predators. I tried calling out, tried moving down the stairs, but every step toward the ground brought the voices closer in cadence, shifting position, always just out of reach, always blocking my exit. I ended up sitting on the top platform, knees pulled to my chest, flashlight trained on the forest floor, listening. The wind rattled the old framework, and the trees groaned under their own weight, but the murmuring didn't waver. I didn't sleep. I couldn't leave. I sat, shaking, listening to those voices drift through the dark woods. Hours passed. Moonlight slid across the treetops, and the voices circled and moved in patterns I couldn't follow, sometimes whispering as if debating, sometimes silent for long stretches, letting the forest sounds fill the air. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe squatters, some isolated couple, lost and living off the mountain. But the cadence, the strange harmony, the way they seemed to anticipate my movements, made that impossible. I considered climbing down fast, sprinting through the undergrowth, but the tower is surrounded by steep ridges, brambles, and unsteady earth. One wrong step, and I could break a leg, or worse. The forest waited below like a patient thing, still and alive, shadows crawling across the trunks with every gust of wind. By dawn, when the first slivers of sunlight barely touched the mountaintops, the voices were gone. The forest returned to normal, as if nothing had ever happened. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, crisp and empty. I climbed down slowly, boots sinking in mud, hands still trembling, scanning for footprints, for any sign that someone had actually been there. Nothing. No footprints, no dropped gear, no evidence of any living person. The forest floor was untouched except for the marks I'd left myself. I walked back to the ranger station, pale and shaking, radioing in my return, careful not to let my voice betray how unnerved I truly was. Weeks later, I kept thinking about it. I walked that tower several more times during late-night shifts, alone, and never heard another sound like that. Nothing. It was as if the voices had been part of the night itself, a memory embedded in the darkness, something impossible to touch or follow. I tried rational explanations, echoes carried from distant hollows, animals moving in unusual ways, maybe even exhaustion and stress playing tricks on my ears. But I can't convince myself. Even now, when the wind whistles down that ridge, I hear fragments of conversation just at the edge of hearing, soft syllables curling in and out like smoke. Every time I see the tower, it's impossible to ignore the way the moonlight falls across the metal steps, like shadows poised to move, like the platform itself is waiting for something or someone to return. I've mentioned it to other rangers, hesitated, shrugged it off. Nobody else reported anything, and over the years the tower has stood empty, a relic in the misty Appalachians. Yet, I know what I heard. I know how it moved. I know that at one point I couldn't leave, couldn't descend, couldn't act at all without the forest responding to me, almost consciously. And though the voices never returned in the same way, I feel them sometimes, lingering in the hollow wind, brushing against my memory, a reminder that the mountains hold secrets older than any map, any patrol, any history I can claim to know. The memory sticks in my chest, cold and unshakable, a weight heavier than any pack I've carried through the peaks. I don't walk that ridge alone anymore after midnight. I never let the fire tower come into view without thinking of the voices circling, waiting, patient, and somehow aware that I remember. Even years later, I can hear them just below the threshold of hearing, whispering in a language I can't name, murmuring the secrets of a mountain I thought I knew, and I wonder if anyone else has ever heard them, or if it's a sound meant only for those who wander too long, too late, into the dark. By the time the sun rises over Raven's Hollow, the forest returns to normal, or the closest thing to normal a place like that can have. Birds begin their hesitant songs, squirrels scurry along the ridges, and the wind carries the familiar scent of pine and wet earth. But deep in my chest, the memory remains. I think about it when I'm alone in the station, when the lights are low, when the night is deep. And I can't forget that there's a part of the mountain that doesn't follow the rules of maps or reason. That part waits. It waits for footsteps at midnight, for a ranger's flashlight to cut the darkness, for ears that will hear voices whispering from platforms where no one should be. And I know, as sure as I know anything, that those voices, whatever or whoever they were real. Not imagined, not tricks of fatigue or wind, but real. And I'll never walk that fire tower ridge alone at night again. Even now I can close my eyes and hear them circling, faint but deliberate, voices carried on the wind, reminding me that some parts of the Appalachians have eyes and ears older than any human memory, and they are still paying attention. Story 3. The Tent Beside the Frozen Creek. It was early spring, the kind where the mountains are shedding winter slowly, and the creek waters are still half frozen, jagged ice clinging to the banks like old scars. I'd been assigned to check on an old backcountry campsite, a place I'd walked past in summers but rarely in the shoulder season. The snow had mostly melted on the main trail, but the side paths were still slick with mud and ice, forcing careful steps with each footfall. When I arrived at the creek, the air was sharp and wet, carrying the scent of thawing earth and pine. And that's when I saw it. A single green tent, pitched neatly beside the rushing water. Its flaps were zip tight, everything about it pristine, undisturbed. No boots leaned against the trees, no fire ring or cooking gear, no footprints in the mud, nothing to suggest anyone had been there for days, weeks even. The tent seemed to sit there by itself, as if it had grown out of the ground overnight. I called out softly, my voice carried across the half-frozen creek. "Hello? Anyone here?" I waited, ears straining for any sign of a response. But the only reply was the creek itself, its low gurgle and the distant crack of ice shifting. I circled the tent cautiously, flashlight in hand, my breath making clouds in the cold air. Finally, I unzipped the flap, expecting a sleeping bag tossed carelessly inside or maybe abandoned gear. Instead, I found 3 blankets, neatly folded, stacked with an almost obsessive precision. On top lay a spiral-bound notebook, its cover scuffed, its pages mostly torn out except for the first. I opened it. In heavy, deliberate pencil, scrawled across the page were the words, "Don't sleep here when the ice is breaking." My stomach clenched. I've hiked these backcountry trails in every season, seen the creek rise and fall, but the warning felt real, immediate, like a voice speaking directly to me. As daylight faded into evening, I set up my own camp a few 100 yards back, keeping the tent in sight. The forest seemed unusually still, the way it does before something shifts, the wind absent, the normal night sounds muted. I kept thinking about that notebook. Who had left it? Why so precise, so careful? I told myself to shake it off, that maybe a previous camper had learned a lesson and left the warning for anyone foolish enough to camp there in early spring. But the quiet, the stillness, pressed in on me. Shadows moved differently here. The air held a tension I couldn't name, like the mountain itself was watching and waiting. Around midnight, I heard it. The creek had begun to roar, ice breaking apart in sheets, water surging and smashing against frozen edges. The sound was violent, the kind that sends a chill under your skin, the kind that makes you question every step you've taken on the wet rocks and mud. My flashlight flickered as I looked toward the tent. That's when I swore I heard something else. A sound too deliberate to belong to the wind, a slow zipper, dragging through the canvas of the tent I had left untouched. I froze, heart hammering, every rational thought screaming that it was impossible. I stayed still, listening, every nerve taut, waiting for the sound to repeat. It did, soft and measured, followed by an odd creaking, like weight shifting inside a structure that should have been empty. I forced myself to rise, gripping my flashlight, edging closer to the tent. The ice on the creek groaned, large chunks shifting downstream with a muffled crash, and yet the zipper came again, clear, methodical. I called out, voice shaky, "Hey, is someone in there?" Silence. The tent remained zipped, the blankets neatly stacked inside. Nothing stirred. I reached for the flap, trembling, pulled it back, and found nothing. The inside was empty, exactly as I'd seen it before, save for the blankets and the notebook. My rational mind tried to anchor me. Maybe the sound had carried strangely across the ice and water. Maybe an animal had brushed against the fabric, but it felt deliberate, human in its cadence. The way someone might move with intention, with purpose, without fear. The night stretched on endlessly. I sat just beyond the tent, flashlight beams sweeping over the creek, over the trees, over the frozen and shifting banks, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the brush, every low groan of shifting ice made my muscles tighten, made me flinch. I stayed awake hours longer than I should have, listening, staring, heart aching with a dread I couldn't name. The creek finally calmed after some time, but the memory of that slow, deliberate zipper, the way it sounded as if it were testing me, measuring me, challenging my presence, lingered, echoing in the hollow spaces between trees and ice. I didn't sleep that night, and by dawn I had packed up and left, boots squelching through the mud, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Nothing followed, nothing called after me, the forest resuming its ordinary rhythms as if the previous night had never existed. But I couldn't shake the unease, couldn't erase the mental image of that empty tent, the neatly stacked blankets, the torn pages of the notebook, or the sound of someone moving within it while I wasn't looking. I've returned to that section of trail since, under sunlight, under the calm of a spring day, but the tent is gone. No trace remains. No flattened ground, no peg marks, no footprints. It's as though the camp itself had never been there, like it only exists when the ice is breaking and the night is dark and no one else is around to witness it. Sometimes, when I hike alone near that creek, I swear I can hear the faintest dragging sound, soft and irregular over the flow of water, as if something, or someone, is still inside that tent somewhere, waiting. The memory of that night is lodged in my chest, tight and cold. A weight that refuses to lift. Even now, months later, I hear it when the wind carries strange notes through the trees, when the creek groans under half-frozen sheets of ice, when the forest leans in just a little too close and the shadows stretch too long. And I think of the notebook, the single message scrawled in heavy pencil, and I wonder if anyone else has ever heard the zipper in the night, if anyone else has ever found the empty tent waiting beside the ice, or if it's meant for me alone, a warning I can't fully understand, a fear I can't outrun, a presence that lingers just at the edge of knowing. I haven't returned to camp beside that frozen creek after dark since that night. I don't even walk past it without pausing, listening to the current, looking for movement, for a flash of green canvas, for the shadows that shouldn't be there. The forest around it feels different now, quieter, more deliberate, like it remembers me. And every time I tell the story, the hair on my arms rises, the memory of that zipper slides along the edges of my perception, and I know it isn't over. It isn't something I can map, report, or explain. It is as real as the ice, as real as the creek, as real as the blankets, folded neatly, waiting for someone foolish enough to follow the creek's frozen path at night. Even in the daytime, I find myself scanning the banks, hoping not to see it, hoping not to hear it. But I can't help it. I can still imagine the flap, trembling, the sound of the zipper dragging slowly across the canvas, a presence unseen, patient, testing, marking, reminding me that some places in the mountains hold themselves apart from time and reason. And I know, without question, that when the ice is breaking, if you stop, if you linger, the tent will be there, the blankets neatly stacked, the notebook waiting to warn or to lure. And I will never, ever forget that sound, or that night, or the way the forest seemed to breathe around me, alive and watching, while I realized too late that I was not alone. Story 4. The Man in the Smoky Clearing. The fog had settled early that evening, thick and low, wrapping the Blue Ridge Mountains in a grey, suffocating blanket that made every familiar tree seem alien. I was on a routine patrol, hiking a ridge I knew like the back of my hand, checking for signs of illegal campfires or trespassers, when I noticed a haze rising ahead. At first, I thought it was smoke from someone's fire, illegal or careless, lingering over the undergrowth. As I approached, I realized the ground was still smoldering, the ash dark and damp, as if a fire had burned with considerable heat only hours before. The smell was off, though. Not the familiar scent of wood and pine, but sharp, metallic, almost like iron mixed with charred earth, My pulse tightened. Fires weren't unusual, but this felt wrong, and my instincts told me to be cautious. In the center of the clearing stood a man. His posture was rigid, unnervingly still. He wore a ranger's uniform, but it was old, outdated, with brass buttons tarnished, boots scuffed in a way that suggested decades of wear. I froze, taking careful steps forward, trying to reconcile the sight with reality. He didn't move. He didn't acknowledge me. His eyes were fixed past me, looking into the tree line behind me as though waiting for something, or someone. I called out softly, voice cracking in the dense fog, but there was no response, no acknowledgement, nothing to indicate he had even heard me. I felt a cold weight settle into my chest, a dread I couldn't name. Something about him was impossibly still, impossibly patient. I cautiously turned around to see what he was watching, scanning the fog-thickened forest for any signs of movement. Branches swayed gently in the wind, and the usual night sounds, crickets, distant owl calls, filled the clearing, but there was nothing there, not a hint of motion. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. When I turned back toward the center of the clearing, he was gone. Not moved, not hidden behind a tree. Gone. The smoldering ground remained, grey ash cooling into blackened soil, the scent of metal lingering, clinging to my nostrils in a way that made me gag slightly. I took a step forward, boots crunching on the ash, but found no trace of him. I spent the next hour circling the clearing, scanning every inch of the fog-laden ridge, calling out his name, but there was nothing, only the acrid smoke and the sense that I had intruded on something I shouldn't have. I backed off slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the smouldering earth, waiting for some sign, anything that would explain the impossible encounter. But the clearing seemed untouched, aside from the faint scorch marks. The forest beyond remained impenetrably silent, as if holding its breath. I left the area unsettled, boots sinking into the damp forest floor, replaying the encounter over and over, trying to reason it away. Perhaps a hallucination born of exhaustion and the oppressive fog, maybe a figure from an old photograph in my mind, I told myself, trying to stay grounded. Weeks later, curiosity overpowered reason. I returned to the ranger station archives, flipping through decades-old photos and records, tracing names and faces from the precinct long before my tenure. That's when I found him, the man I had seen, staring past me in the clearing in full ranger attire. His posture, the uniform, the scuffed boots, it matched perfectly. The photo was black and white, edges worn, the kind of print that smelled faintly of old chemicals and dust. I read the caption, Ranger John H. McAllister, deceased in the line of duty, 1964. My stomach knotted. And the memory of the clearing, the smouldering ground, the smell of iron, the impossibly patient stare, returned in full force. I ran the scenario through my mind again, every detail lining up in impossible ways. The uniform, the location, the time of day, the forest itself. None of it made sense. None of it should have been possible. I returned to that clearing months later, under the same thick fog, the same grey light, hoping perhaps to understand, to find some rational explanation. The ground was empty, only frost and leaves, no smouldering remains, no trace of the metallic scent, but I felt it still, the way the space seemed alive, expectant, holding itself apart from the rest of the forest. I couldn't explain why the memory of the man's stillness haunted me so, why the forest seemed to whisper around the edges of my mind. I realized then that the mountains themselves carry memories, layers of time and presence that humans can barely perceive. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was my imagination. But the way that clearing pressed against my awareness, even in daylight, left me unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. Even now, months later, when I hike near that ridge on foggy evenings, I feel the presence again, an almost imperceptible weight at the edge of perception. Branches seem to sway differently, shadows stretch unnaturally long, and sometimes I swear I can feel a gaze from the fog itself. The memory of his stillness, the smell of iron, the smouldering ground, all remain lodged in my chest. I tell myself it's part of the mountains, part of the forest legend that makes the Appalachian wilderness feel alive in ways that defy explanation. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that the clearing exists outside of time, a place where something watches, waits, and remembers. The photograph in the archives haunts me most. Every detail in it, the uniform, the posture, the age, matches the man I saw, and the date of his death is etched in my mind. It forces me to question everything I thought I knew about reality in these mountains. The clearing, the fog, the metallic smell of smouldering ground. The sudden disappearance of the figure, I replay it all in my head, and it never feels less real. The forest, I've realized, keeps secrets, not like humans do, but in ways that twist and linger, embedding themselves in perception, memory, and fear. I've tried to avoid that ridge since, taken longer paths, avoided late-night patrols near the clearing, but every time the fog rolls in, thick and low, I remember him. I remember the way he stood there, impossibly still, waiting for something I could not see, and how, when I looked again, he had vanished without a trace. I wonder if he was waiting for someone else, or if he was waiting for me, if his gaze had followed me long before I realized it. The feeling of being observed, of standing on the edge of something ancient and patient, lingers in ways words cannot fully capture. There is no resolution, no rational closure. The forest keeps its secrets tightly, and I have learned not to expect answers from it. All I can do is remember the smell of acrid smoke, the faint weight of presence, the rigid stance of a man who should have been long gone. Some nights, I find myself walking through my dreams back to that clearing, fog swirling around me, the weight of his gaze pressing down, and I wake knowing that the mountains still hold him, still hold me, and that memory is not something easily escaped. I don't know if anyone else has ever seen him. I don't know if the clearing remembers other intruders, or if it saved its patience just for me. All I know is that in these mountains, in the fog, in the quiet of a backcountry night, the forest can make you feel as though time has bent, as though the dead are not entirely gone, as though every shadow, every smouldering ash, every metallic scent carries with it a story the living can barely comprehend. And when I walk the ridges alone, I carry that memory with me, and I am never truly alone. Story 5. The Locked Cabin on Ridge 2. I'd passed the old supply cabin on Ridge 2 dozens of times over the years, always noting its presence from a distance. A squat wooden structure with a rusted tin roof, padlocked securely since before my time. Rangers before me had left records of it being sealed after the last winter supply run, and in all my years patrolling the ridge, I'd never seen it open. The cabin had become part of the landscape, a silent marker, something familiar, yet untouchable. That afternoon, rain poured down in relentless sheets, hammering the leaves, turning the narrow trail to slick mud. I'd been hiking for hours, soaked through and chilled to the bone, and the cabin, even just the thought of it, promised a break from the weather. When I crested a small rise, I saw it. The lock was gone, snapped clean in half, the door hanging ajar. I hesitated, boots slipping slightly on the sodden trail, trying to convince myself it was some previous camper or vandal, someone careless or reckless, maybe even someone seeking shelter like me. But as I approached, I realized the air around the cabin was different. It smelled warm, earthy, faintly of smoke, though the fireplace inside was cold. I pushed the door fully open, and the smell intensified. A dry, almost comforting heat that pressed against my chest. Inside, the shelves were lined with supplies I didn't recognize. Tin cans with faded labels I couldn't read, thick wool blankets neatly folded, kerosene lanterns that looked well-oiled and ready for use. The room itself was immaculate, as if someone had just walked away. My fingers brushed against a canister of beans, and a chill ran through me despite the warmth. I stepped fully inside, boots squeaking on the wooden floorboards, trying to understand why the cabin, padlocked for decades, now stood open, supplied, and warm-smelling. I called out softly, my voice swallowed by the small room, and heard nothing. No movement, no reply, only the patter of rain on the roof. My pulse thumped hard in my chest, and the forest beyond the open doorway seemed impossibly quiet, as if it, too, were holding its breath. I turned to take in the shelves again, the neat rows of cans, blankets stacked with precision, lanterns in perfect alignment, and felt the uneasy impression that I had walked into someone else's home, a place still occupied, though no one was there. I hesitated too long, and finally decided to step back out onto the trail, rain drenching my jacket, cold seeping into my skin. The warmth vanished the moment I crossed the threshold, leaving only the chill and the patter of rain. But then something made my stomach seize. The cabin door had closed behind me. I could see the wet trail, the surrounding trees, the relentless grey rain, but the door was shut, flush against its frame, lock intact as if nothing had changed. I reached for it, yanking with all my strength, and the door groaned but held. My hands slipped on the wet wood. I cursed under my breath. I tried again, swinging my shoulder into it, and the door finally swung open. Inside, the warmth and supplies were gone. Dust covered the shelves, the blankets lay in disarray, the cans looked like they had sat untouched for years, and the kerosene lanterns were grimy, old, forgotten. The lock that had been snapped in half earlier was nowhere to be seen. I stepped back, stunned, heart racing, the rain soaking my hair and jacket, and wondered if exhaustion or cold had conjured the previous scene. But I knew what I had seen, had smelled, had felt: warmth, presence, careful order, the sense of someone having just left, or still being there, waiting. I circled the cabin, inspecting the walls, the foundation, the trail around it. Nothing indicated that anyone had been inside. No footprints in the mud, no fresh marks on the wood, nothing disturbed in the surrounding brush. The forest was indifferent, rain falling evenly, wind shaking wet leaves, everything else exactly as it had been for years. Yet my mind refused to reconcile what I had experienced: the warmth, the neat supplies, the smell, the fleeting sense of human presence. I could still feel it in my chest, the pressing weight of another's careful arrangement, someone meticulous, someone deliberate. It wasn't threatening, not in the traditional sense, but it was impossibly intrusive, a reminder that the forest and its history held more than I could comprehend. I returned to that ridge several times afterward, always prepared, always hoping to catch a glimpse, some rational explanation. The cabin never repeated its strange transformation. Every time it was padlocked, dust-laden, untouched, exactly as it had been before. I checked the archives at the ranger station, looking for old supply runs, maintenance logs, anything to explain how a cabin could appear stocked and warm in the middle of a rainy afternoon, and found nothing. No reports of vandals, no forgotten visitors, no notes suggesting recent use. The cabin was, in all official records, as it had always been, closed, forgotten, inert. I can't explain the event to anyone else without sounding unhinged. Yet the memory clings with a weight I can't shake. The sudden warmth, the metallic scent of lantern oil and canned goods, the meticulous order, and the impossible stillness outside the doorway, watching as I left. It sits in the back of my mind, a quiet dread that surfaces during storms, when I hike alone on ridge trails, when the wind rattles old cabins and the trees seem to bend closer than they should. Even under sunlight, even months later, I remember the heat, the smell, the presence, and the impossible feeling of being observed, if only for a moment, by someone or something that should not have been there. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of that cabin. I see the snapped lock, feel the warmth pressing against my skin, smell the kerosene and wool, hear the faint creak of floorboards as if someone is moving just beyond my vision. I wake with my chest tight, hands tingling from the imagined cold, a shiver of recognition and fear running down my spine. The mountains, the forest, ridge to itself seems to carry that memory now, an echo of something that happened, or almost happened, that I cannot name or understand. I don't take that path when the weather turns rainy anymore. I've warned other rangers to be cautious near the old cabin, to stay outside, to avoid lingering. I don't share all the details. Some things I've learned are better kept to memory, because speaking them aloud gives them weight. And I do not want to draw attention to whatever it was that day. The cabin remains a silent sentinel on the ridge, padlocked, dust-covered, ordinary in every visible way. But I know better. I know that for a brief, fleeting moment, it was not ordinary at all. It had presence, warmth, life, human or not, and it vanished, leaving only the forest and my memory to bear witness. Even now, when storms roll over the ridge, I feel the pull to look, to see if the door has opened again, if the warmth returns, if the shelves are lined with neatly folded blankets and tin cans ready for use. I resist. And yet the memory gnaws, persistent, as if the cabin itself remembers me, waits for my return, and keeps part of me within its walls. The forest holds it there, unchanging, patient, quietly terrifying, a place where reality bends just enough to remind you that the mountains keep secrets older than any of us, secrets that can reach out, even if only for a fleeting moment, to make us feel less alone and far more vulnerable than we ever imagined. Story 6. The Radio That Spoke My Name. The northern sector of the forest always felt different from the rest of the park, colder somehow, heavier with shadows, even in daylight. That afternoon, the sky had turned leaden, a low grey ceiling pressing down through the tall pines. I was on a routine patrol, walking the ridge trail that cuts through the old logging paths, hand radio clipped to my vest, scanner humming with the usual chatter of other rangers and occasional hikers. Nothing unusual had happened all day. The forest was quiet, the wind teasing loose branches, the occasional jay or crow calling in the distance. Then, without warning, the radio crackled. At first, I thought it was the usual static, a lost transmission bleeding across frequencies, but it wasn't. It was my name, full, slow, deliberate, spoken with a weight I couldn't place. Ethan Blake. The voice was deep, unfamiliar, resonant, and it carried through the earpiece with a clarity that made me jerk back, heart spiking. I dropped my hand to the unit, flipping the channel and checking the signal meter. It was dead flat. No frequency, no interference, nothing registering at all. I hesitated, gripping the radio tighter, thinking maybe it was a prank, some distant ranger trying to unsettle a rookie. "Who's this?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady, my words swallowed by the dense forest around me. Silence. Then, the voice again, slow and deliberate. "Ethan Blake. Turn around." I spun, expecting maybe a lost hiker, another ranger, someone standing on the trail behind me. Nothing. Just the trees dripping rain from their needles and the faint smell of wet pine and earth. I twisted in a circle, trying to find any hint of movement, any sign of another person, and saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, nothing that could explain the voice. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I glanced down at the radio, expecting it to be dead, but it was still in my hand, alive in its impossibility, the voice echoing faintly in my mind, even when the speaker went silent. I kept walking, radio pressed to my chest, the forest suddenly more oppressive than I had ever remembered it. Every snap of a branch beneath my boots sounded like deliberate footsteps. Every swish of leaves in the wind felt like someone shifting just beyond my vision. The trail curved, dipped into a small hollow, and still nothing emerged. I tried speaking into the radio again, my voice trembling slightly, asking for identification, any response. Only silence followed, thick and suffocating. The forest had swallowed my words whole. Hours later, I returned to the ranger station, drenched from the rain, hands shaking as I logged the patrol. The station was quiet. Other rangers were off duty, the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of coffee filling the office. I scribbled notes in the logbook, trying to reconcile what I had heard with reality. When I checked the channel history, there were no transmissions, no outgoing calls, no interference, nothing that could account for a voice, deep and deliberate, saying my name in the northern sector. My supervisor gave me a polite nod when I mentioned it, the kind of nod that says, "I hear you, but we can't do anything." That night, back in my small cabin, the forest rain drumming steadily against the roof, I tried to sleep, telling myself it had been exhaustion, the echoes of a long day in isolation, my mind conjuring voices in the static. But sleep came only in fragments. I was woken at least 3 times by the sensation of someone standing just beyond the door, quiet and waiting, and the same voice, low, deliberate, saying my name. This time not over the radio, but in the room itself. I sat up, listening, heart pounding, scanning the cabin in the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains. The door was closed, the lock intact. The radio lay on the table, silent, and yet the voice persisted, murmuring just beyond my threshold. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the cabin door locked, flashlight in hand, scanning the shadows, listening to the wind, the dripping of water from the eaves, the occasional cry of a distant owl. Every small noise was magnified, every creak of floorboard or shift of timber sending my pulse racing. Morning eventually came, grey and drizzly, washing the forest in pale light. I forced myself to move, making coffee, checking the radio again, turning it on and off, moving around the cabin in careful loops to convince myself that nothing had entered, nothing had been waiting for me. Still, the weight of the voice lingered, curling at the edges of my mind. Days later, I walked the northern sector again, radio in hand, scanning the trails with heightened attention. The forest felt the same as always, but I couldn't shake the impression that it was watching me differently, that the shadows had shifted subtly since that night. I repeated my patrols, cautious, methodical, double-checking paths, listening for anything out of place. Sometimes I hear a faint crackle through the radio, almost static, almost my name, and my stomach drops, pulse spiking, every nerve alert. The radiometer never moves. There is no signal. It is impossible. I've tried to tell other rangers, friends, anyone who will listen, about the voice, about the cabin, about the nights when I hear it just outside my door. Some nod politely, some chuckle, some avoid the conversation entirely, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt. That voice, calling me deliberately, knowing me, following me across the ridge, across the years of quiet forest paths. It is real, and it persists. Even now, months later, the northern sector calls to me in small ways. The wind whistles through the trees differently. The rain drumming against the roofs of cabins takes on a strange cadence, and I imagine that same deep, deliberate voice, speaking my name in the night, patient, waiting, as if the forest itself has claimed part of me, tethered to it through some quiet, unseen channel. The radio sits on the table silent, but I cannot dismiss it. I cannot unhear it. And each time I pick it up, scan the channels, the hair on my arms rises, the cold crawls up my spine. And I remember that in these mountains, isolation and quiet are never absolute. There is always someone or something listening, waiting. Speak. Story 7. The footprints that followed. Uphill fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the ridge in a thick, unbroken blanket of white that sparkled under the weak morning sun. I'd been out on patrol since first light, boots crunching through the pristine powder, following the narrow maintenance trail that wound along the ridge. The valley below was a sheet of grey fog, moving and curling like smoke over the forests. And the world felt quiet in a way that made every snap of a branch or distant crow call seem unnaturally loud. I paused at a clearing where the trail opened up, the wind cutting sharper here than lower down, and that's when I saw it, a single set of footprints in the snow, bare feet. Deep impressions pressed into the fresh powder, leading uphill into the ridge forest where no path existed. At first, I assumed someone had wandered off trail, a lost hiker or hunter maybe, and my instincts told me to keep moving cautiously. The prints were fresh, snow still powdered their edges, tiny flakes resting on the toes and arches as if the wind itself had carefully settled them. I followed, boots sinking into the cold, loose snow, the crunch echoing in the hushed forest. The ridge narrowed, trees growing closer, limbs heavy with snow, and the footprints kept climbing, deliberate, steady, impossibly patient. Every step I took, the impressions stayed clear, unmelted, as though someone, or something, was always just ahead of me, leaving their mark in perfect relief against the white. After nearly a mile, the slope became steeper, the trees thicker, and still the prints continued, leading me higher into a part of the ridge I knew well, but rarely travelled. I realized then that there was something impossible about the tracks. I had been stepping in them the entire way, my boots sinking into the same impressions, yet no second set of prints followed mine. No drag marks, no displaced snow, nothing. It was as if the footprints had been laid just for me, perfectly timed, never disturbed by my presence. My pulse quickened, the cold biting harder through my layers as I stared at the unbroken impressions. The forest around me seemed to lean closer, the wind picking up and rattling the trees, making every branch creak and moan. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that perhaps the snow had compacted in some strange way, or I had misjudged the trail, that a single lost hiker had wandered here before dawn. But the pace, the spacing of the prints, it was deliberate, unnervingly so. I felt the uncanny sensation of being watched, a subtle shift in the air, like someone breathing just beyond the tree line. The silence pressed down around me, punctuated only by the occasional distant call of a jay or the crunch of my own boots. Eventually, I reached the top of a small rise where the forest opened slightly into a shallow clearing. The footprints ended abruptly at a stand of ancient pines, their trunks twisted and knotted, roots rising from the snow in grotesque patterns. I scanned the area, eyes straining to pierce the pale morning light, searching for the person or presence responsible. There was nothing. No one crouched behind a tree, no hiker lost in the snow, not even an animal track that could explain the bare feet. The prints were gone, vanished as if the snow itself had swallowed them whole. Shaken, I turned to head back down the ridge, boots crunching again in the fresh powder. That's when I noticed them, another set of footprints forming in the snow behind me. Bare feet again, deep impressions, appearing one by one in perfect alignment with my own stride. My heart lurched. cold shooting through me sharper than the snow biting at my ankles. Every time I took a step, a new print followed, keeping exact pace. I stopped abruptly, spun around, but there was nothing visible in the trees, nothing at all to explain the tracks appearing in perfect sequence behind me. I began to move faster, adrenaline making my legs feel heavy, yet insistent, trying to outrun the invisible follower. Every step I took, another print appeared, pacing me perfectly. I risked glancing back again and again, each time catching nothing, just the wind through the trees and the occasional scatter of snow falling from branches. My breaths came in short, sharp gasps, fogging in the cold air, each inhale tight in my chest. I tried to shout, to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the vast silence of the ridge, the fog of my panic making the world feel smaller, tighter, impossibly constraining. Hours seemed to pass as I scrambled down the trail, the footprints continuing relentlessly, appearing behind me no matter how fast or erratically I moved. They followed through the bends in the trail, over fallen logs, even around the bends where I jumped to avoid sinking into hidden drifts. Nothing caught my eye in the forest, yet the evidence remained impossible and undeniable. At one point, I slipped, falling hard into the snow, face pressed against the frozen surface. I looked up, expecting to see the trail momentarily cleared, but the prints paused for a moment, perfectly spaced in the snow above me, then continued as I struggled to my feet. Eventually, the ridge began to level out, the forest thinning, and I could make out the trailhead below, where the valley opened and the fog had lifted slightly. I dared a glance back, my stomach twisting, and the footprints had stopped, but only temporarily. I could see the last set at the far edge of the ridge, deeply embedded, edges sharp, undisturbed by wind or sun, waiting as if for me to reach them again. I hurried the last few hundred yards, boots slipping in the melting snow, lungs burning, heart pounding so hard I feared it might burst from my chest. When I reached the main trail and turned fully to look back, the ridge was empty. No footprints. No trace of the ones that had followed me, only fresh, untouched snow stretching uphill into the forest. I didn't stop moving until I reached the ranger station, drenched, shivering, hands raw from gripping my walking stick, face stinging from cold and fear. I tried to explain what had happened to my colleagues, but the words came out fractured, full of disbelief and tension. Some nodded politely, some frowned, and a few offered weak reassurances, joking about frostbite or cabin fever, but none could account for what I had seen. I kept returning in my mind to the rhythm of the footprints, the impossible pacing, the way they had mirrored me step for step, as though something unseen had been practicing patience for decades, lying in wait. Following me uphill through snow no one else had disturbed. Even days later, I could feel the ridge calling back, pulling at the edges of my memory. The snow, the bare prints, the forest holding its silence. It stayed with me, pressing in during quiet moments. When the wind rattled the cabin windows, when I hiked alone along lesser-used trails. I find myself glancing over my shoulder even when no snow is present, imagining those footprints forming one by one, stepping in perfect cadence behind me, relentless, patient, impossible. I haven't returned to Ridge 2 since the snow melted, and I don't know if I will. The memory is too vivid, too precise, too haunting. Sometimes I dream of it, walking uphill through thick white powder, hearing only my own breath and the distant drip of melting snow, when suddenly I notice the prints again appearing behind me, forming slowly, deliberately, keeping perfect pace, as though something unseen is marking time with me and waiting for me to notice. And in the dream, I always wake before I can turn and see what, or who, is making them. The ridge, the snow, the forest, they hold it there, a quiet, patient memory that follows even when I am elsewhere. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it, can't make sense of how something unseen could pace me step for step through untouched snow. All I know is that the memory is real, that the weight of it lingers in the pit of my stomach, and that whenever I walk alone in winter woods, I feel it again, the invisible footprints, always behind me, always following, always patient.